You're watching ESC News. Thank you for joining us. And finally, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Cambodia and Australia. One of the ways the Australian Embassy in Cambodia decided to commemorate this milestone was by partnering with and supporting the 11th Cambodia International Film Festival to celebrate both Cambodian and Australian cinema.
This year's CIFF featured a special Australian Panorama, showcasing 20 films from Australia that span across the past 7 decades since diplomatic relations were established between Cambodia and Australia in 1952. According to the festival program, the 20 films in the panorama were chosen for how they reflect the huge growth and prominence of Australian cinema, especially from the 1970s onwards, and as a fascinating point of contrast with the huge growth in Cambodian cinema and creative arts in the 1960s. The Australian Panorama kicked off on 29th June with the 2012 musical comedy drama The Sapphires, directed by Wayne Blair. The film tells the story of a talented Australian Aboriginal girl group that traveled to Vietnam to entertain U.S. troops in 1968. The film is based on a 2004 stage play of the same name, which was loosely based on a real-life girl group from the 1960s. The first secretary of the Australian Embassy in Cambodia, Ben Cumming, spoke with EAC News after the opening screening at major Cineplex Eon 1 and explained why The Sapphires had been chosen to open the festival's special focus on Australian cinema.
To begin with, The Sapphires is just such a feel-good film. It's obviously got some really complex undercurrents that are important to us in terms of our Indigenous diplomacy agenda, but it's also just a really good, feel-good film that sort of showcases Australia really well. So we thought it was a perfect choice for the opening of the panorama of Australian cinema.
On why the Australian Embassy decided to use the festival to commemorate the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations, First Secretary Cumming said it was all about celebrating cultural links between people.
Well, part of it is that we have a very strong people-to-people relationship that sort of underpins the Cambodia-Australia relationship. There's about 66,000 Australians that have Cambodian heritage, so it's about the size of Kampong Thom. We thought the film festival is a great way to sort of showcase Australian culture and to help sort of celebrate that cultural and people link that does continue to sort of bind our relationship. It has for the last 70. We would like it to for the next 70, and we think bringing people together, learning a little bit more about each other's cultures is a great way to do that.
The panorama was curated by Variety film critic, producer, and festival curator Richard Kuipers, who has been involved with CIFF since it first began and has been to every single iteration of the festival since. When choosing the 20 films, he said what he looked at most was presenting a broad cross-section of Australian cinema and Australian life, but one which could still be accessible enough for most audiences to understand.
I chose some wonderful comedies, such as Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and Malcolm, which was one of the most successful films in the program. The audience here absolutely went crazy for Malcolm. A little film from 1986. It's not the most famous Australian film ever made. In fact, a lot of people may never even have heard of Malcolm, but it's one that I just knew this film is so special. It will play here in Cambodia in 2022 and the audience will love it. And I also wanted to show some of the more dark aspects of Australian society. Films such as Wake in Fright, a film like Jeddah about Aboriginal issues 70 years ago that paint a very critical picture. And I think this is important because you need to show the aspects of the society in all its diversity to present a true picture. So that's what I was trying to do.
Other prominent titles featured in the panorama included George Miller's 1981 classic Mad Max 2, Baz Luhrmann's Strictly Ballroom, Henry Safran's Storm Boy, and Jennifer Kent's The Babadook. The 2019 film Buoyancy, which featured a Cambodian lead and was partly shot in Cambodia, was also screened. During the 6-day festival, Kuipers had one of the busiest schedules, going back and forth from different venues across Phnom Penh to introduce as many films from the panorama as possible for the audiences in attendance.
It was really important for me to introduce the films, and I introduced every single film that I possibly could except when there was a clash, and also to watch the film with the audience. I couldn't do it every single time, but I watched a lot of films with the audience and spoke to audience members afterwards to get their reactions and get their response. And I'm really pleased with the responses that I got to the films.
The last day of the 11th CIFF on 3rd July also marked the closing screening of the Australian Special Focus Program. The closing film, Lion, was personally chosen by the Australian ambassador to Cambodia, Pablo Kang. While introducing the film, Kuipers reflected briefly on the success of the Australian Panorama as a whole and stated with certainty that it was the largest Australian retrospective program presented in any Southeast Asian film festival in history. The Australian ambassador to Cambodia, Pablo Kang, spoke with EAC News after the program ended about how the collaboration between the Australian Embassy and CIFF had first started.
Sure, it was actually in 2020 when the 10th edition of the Cambodian International Film Festival was launched that we started our collaboration with Cambodia. We had a couple of Australian films showing in that festival at the time, but if you recall, it was March 2020. And pretty much almost as soon as the festival started, COVID descended upon Cambodia. The government had to close cinemas, and so that was the end of that. But we had always hoped that once COVID had been brought under control, that we could do an even bigger collaboration with the Cambodian International Film Festival, and this year was the perfect timing for that, with the vaccines and the support that we've provided, other countries have provided, meaning that cinemas can open again, and that we were able to bring at least 20 Australian movies as part of a panorama of Australian cinema to Cambodia for the festival, and also to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Australia and Cambodia.
Ambassador Kang further elaborated that the embassy's support of CIFF was also based on the belief that the foundation of any strong relationship between two countries is in the people-to-people connections, which is especially evident through arts and culture, of which film is a very big part.
Cambodia is an incredibly young society. Roughly 2/3 of the population is under 30. They love going to the movies. There's been such a great interest in all the movies shown at the festival, including the Australian movies here this week.
In addition to the Panorama program, the film festival also featured a number of other Australian touchpoints. There was the special exhibition on Australian Cambodian film director Alison Chorn, who flew in from Adelaide to present her work in Cambodia for the first time. A special film discussion presented by veteran documentary filmmaker James Gerrand, who has been filming in Cambodia since the early 1970s, and a masterclass presentation by Richard Kuipers on the 120-year history of Australian cinema. The Cambodia International Film Festival returned for its 11th edition in 2022 after a 2-year pandemic-induced hiatus. The festival was held from 28th June to 3rd July at various venues across Phnom Penh, featuring 144 films from 26 countries and 36 additional events, including masterclasses, cinema talks, and discussions.